Dr. Andrea Benvenuti has graduated in a political science and international studies from the University of Florence, Italy. He has also received a master's by research in politics from Monash University and a doctorate in philosophy and international relations from Oxford University. He's currently working as an associate professor in politics and international relations at the University of New South Wales, where he is teaching international history and contemporary diplomacy. Some of his many areas of interest cover topics such as international history, 20th century international history, Cold War history, Western European politics, European integration, modern Italian politics, and foreign policy, as well as Western foreign policy and Indian foreign policy. So, Andrea, welcome.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you very much for the very long introduction. You've been very kind.
Well, well, no choice. You've done quite a lot. um, okay, I was thinking to get started. I was wondering if we could concentrate on Italian politics to begin with. Um, what is you? Could you give a brief analysis of the nature of Italian politics since the Second World War? I mean, from my understanding, it went from the domination of the Christian Democrats during the post-war period to the stability of the Craxi government of the 1980s. We had the Berlusconi decade from 1994 to 2013. Then we went on to see the rise of the Five Star Movement, and with that, Euroscepticism, which accumulated in the 2018 Government of Change coalition with the Lega. That collapsed, and we had Mario Draghi come in for a while, and now it seems to be the national populist government of Prime Minister Maloney. Why do you think this is the case? Is it purely a political, or is it more a reflection of the mindset of the people? And what do you think needs to be done to see Italy stabilize and live up to its potential?
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's a very difficult question, and it's a very difficult task indeed to try to compress 8 years of Italian politics in few minutes. But if I could summarize it very briefly, I would say that broadly speaking, Italy has experienced two key phases in its political history past 1945, which is the period, the Cold War era, when the political system was basically centered around two major political parties, and one of which was, as you mentioned, the Christian Democrats, and the other one was the Communist Party, and also, of course, the coalition government was the Christian Democrats were the linchpin of the governing coalition in those years, and supported by a bunch of small parties, the Social Democrats, the Republicans, the Liberals, and eventually the Socialists. So that phase, of course, pretty much ended with the end of the Cold War. The Christian Democrats collapsed in fact, imploded after the end of the Cold War. And to some extent, even the Communist Party had to rebrand itself under different names. At the moment, the heirs of that party are called the Partito Democratico, which roughly translates into a Democratic Party. And so after that phase, after the end of the Cold War, there's been a period of actually way more fluid, with parties that were much less able to, if you like, dominate the political scene, as well as parties that found more difficult to retain electoral support. And so there's been, over the past 30 years, essentially a kind of bipolar system, also facilitated by a new electoral law. But if you like, it's been a system way less blocked and way more fluid. Coming to the last point that you mentioned, look, it's interesting. What you say makes lots of sense. I mean, Italy gives, of course, the impression of being a rather unstable country because, of course, it had several governments, and the living, well, under the Cold War, the span of life of an Italian government was roughly 9 months. Now is slightly longer, but in reality, under the surface, Italian politics is not as unstable as it seems. Of course, sometimes there's a sort of revolving door politics, but in reality, the country, despite the change of governments, has been, if you like, over the past, if we take a long look at Italian politics, the country has been able to achieve significant industrial economic progress, somewhat slowed down over the past 20 years, but nonetheless, despite this apparent revolving door politics, the country has been able to, if you like, to rebuild after the Second World War, to become a member of the G7, one of the most industrialized country in the world. In fact, in Europe, is after Germany is the second largest manufacturing country, and still is one of the major manufacturing countries in the world. So it's a paradox which you rightly put your emphasis on, because in a sense it seems way less stable than Australia, for instance. Although, of course, some people have been speaking lately of the Italianization of Australian politics. But nonetheless, despite these, if you like, apparent instability, in reality, the country has been able to achieve a number of important objectives since the end of the Second World War. Coming to Meloni, I guess, was the question that you mentioned. I think, well, if I were to base my judgment of what I've been hearing in the Australian press, and particularly on the ABC, that essentially in Italy now is a neo-fascist prime minister, and that's, of course, from my point of view, it's an absurdity, as it's almost tantamount to saying that until 2018 we had, for instance, with Renzi and then with Letta, we had a post-communist prime minister, and of course no one really blinked their eye and just was taken, just as normal fact of life. Yes, of course, the part of politics had its roots in a party which was Marxist and Leninist, and I think the same should apply to the current prime minister. Of course, her current party, Brothers of Italy, its roots are indeed, well, it's the era of so-called Movimento Sociale Italiano, which is Italian social movement, which was indeed a neo-fascist party. But to be fair on Meloni, she's rejected fascism a long time ago, and I don't think there's any risk whatsoever of a return of fascism in Italy. So I think this question has been overblown. And sure enough, as you say, indeed, Meloni as well, she's been leader of this party really since I think 2011 or 2012, if I'm not mistaken. And sure enough, the party could have been described as a populist party, but as a threat to Italian democracy, No, I don't think that's the case. To be fair to her.
Yeah, yeah, it's very true what you said. I mean, I know Italy, unfortunately, has the perception of being like the idiot cousin of Europe, and everyone always talks Germany and France, but Italy's not that far behind. And I think a lot of people forget that. I think the tumultuous nature of the federal government, say, and the type of characters that we have had over the years, such as Berlusconi, I think people kind of forget, they overlook that. They think it's a mess. But yeah, I think it's very true what you say. Things are a lot more stable, and Italy's going a lot more stronger than people think. It's just frustrating because of that case. Has always haunted Italy, but it has so much potential to be right up there with the others, but it always seems to be downplayed. It's quite sad actually, considering its potential.
Italy, I mean, it's since it's for all its history as a united country, Italy became unified in 1861, and since then, in a sense, Italy always found itself in during the last 3-4 decades of the 19th century. I'm sorry, Italy was often regarded as the last of the great powers, and never, of course, quite making it to the very top league. And in a sense, the same applies to today, and also during the even during the Cold War, a country with which, of course, was able to rebuild itself, which grew significantly, which indeed became one of the most industrialized countries, but to some extent never quite matching the capabilities and the capacities of other European states. For instance, you mentioned Germany, France, and England, which with a longer tradition, I'm sorry, of a unitary state, if you like, with a longer tradition of as a united country. And so, to some extent, the fact that Italy reached, I would argue, its independence only quite late in the piece when compared to the other major countries of Europe, in a sense, as it took several years for Italy to truly weld together a rather complex and varied cultural setting, if you like. Italy came to be a united country out of different small states, and also different cultural traditions, different and so that process, we think Italy as a small country in Europe being quite homogeneous, but in reality, for anyone familiar with Italian history and culture, and for anyone traveling, for instance, through Italy, I can tell you that if I were to travel northeast and northwest and people would speak in their own dialect, the chances of me understanding them are still today quite limited. And likewise, if I were to travel down south in Calabria or Sicily, I would find it very difficult to understand people speaking in their own dialect. Of course, I would start to understand them if that dialect then would be interspersed with Italian words. But if they don't do that, I would have no chance to understand them. And so it's been a long process in which, of course, took Italy many years to build itself up as a unitary state, and then of course the fascist experience. And so it's been a complex history. And of course, you're right to point out that sometimes certain personalities haven't, like for instance the shenanigans of Berlusconi, haven't really helped boosting Italian reputation overseas. And so, yes, there are, of course, a number of aspects dragging Italy down to some extent, or rather preventing it to fulfill its potential. But well, that's that's the reality of it, I guess.
Well, yeah, one thing you touched upon that I've always spoke about. Do you think maybe it's changing now, but the idea of being an Italian seems to be Italy seems to not have really grasped it. I mean, people still very much speak of themselves as being from the region from they're from, or the north or the south. They don't. They don't really say I'm Italian. Um, uh, this, uh, I know Mussolini. Okay, maybe you could argue was a bad version, but at least he tried to nationalize the country in the sense of we are all Italian. It doesn't matter where you're from, what part of Italy. Um, do you think that's one of the key reasons that kind of stopped Italy from really getting somewhere, of having this still this decentralized idea of itself?
Yes, I mean, I would argue that today there's a much stronger sense of much stronger Italian identity, or sense of an Italian identity. But what you say is right, because it's been a long and complex and slow phenomenon. But I would say, particularly from the 60s onwards, with the advent of the television, and nowadays with the pervasive presence of the television, radio, and media, uh, the television in particular had an enormous influence in shaping a new sense of being Italian. And so I think today I would argue that actually there's a sense of being Italian, but still, as you point out, there are strong regional identities, regional loyalties, and yes, of course, it's to me, it has an impact on Italy's ability also to perform a stronger role in international affairs, because, of course, Italy can be seen as a quarrelsome country to some extent, with many voices, sometimes a cacophony. It's, of course, a democracy, so with different um, institutional poles and centers, but that applies, of course, to every democracy. But for instance, compared to France or Britain, for instance, is a much less centralized country. And so, to some extent, I would argue that sometimes for foreign governments, it's perhaps too easy to take advantage of intra-Italian squabbles, or sometimes political parties, if you like, competing against each other, and sometimes trying to ingratiate a foreign government to I remember, just to give you an example, and I'm mentioning a political side, but the other political side could presumably have done the same if, for instance, just before the last elections, the leader of the Partito Democratico, the main party of the left, went to Berlin, essentially speaking, that there was talking about this fascist or neo-fascist danger in Italy, and to some extent, it was trying to also send a message back to Italy, but also trying to get, if you like, some sort of international support, or, if you like, And in my view, of course, this internal squabbling, or if you like, internal infighting, to some extent, inevitably gets broadcast overseas, and to some extent, foreign governments sometimes take advantage because they know that Italy, perhaps under strong pressure, would crack, in a sense, wouldn't keep a firm line. But that's, for instance, that's not always the case. If we take, for instance, the example of Russia, I think a significant pressure has been put on the Italian government by the Russians and their media to ensure that the current and the previous government would adopt a way more friendly stance towards Russia. But of course, actually, the previous government, the Draghi government, and the Meloni one actually are maintaining a firm line of support for Ukraine. So that's not always the case, but sometimes it's fair to say that that other countries or other governments, of course, try to take advantage of the situation, and sometimes to in negotiations to if you like, exploit political instability or political squabbling, more to the point, inside Italy. I mean, I could give you several examples, but in international negotiations, every government should try to be, or any political system, if you like, should try to be as cohesive as possible. That is not to say that political differences between parties should not exist, because that's part and parcel of democracy. And it would be fanciful that, just rival political parties would live side by side harmoniously. That's not democracy. Of course, democracy, it's political competition. But nonetheless, when key issues where the national interest is involved, it would be important that, and I'm not simply referring to Australia, to Italy, democracies would be able to, if you like, sometimes to present a cohesive image, cohesive face to the outside world, as well as to other powers, because of course other governments will take advantage of it in negotiations, which is, well, they know what the sometimes, well, they know that perhaps that particular government won't be able to deliver because there's domestic oppositions, and then if you put enough pressure, then the government could possibly crack, make concessions, or not hold a firm line on a given program, given issue. So it's possible.
You touched on it before, but I'm wondering if you could go a little bit more in depth. Prior to Maloney winning government, there was always, as you mentioned, an outcry, a warning that fascism is returning to Italy and all that. Since she got into office, I've noticed that type of criticism has kind of died down a bit. But it's interesting though to look at Italy's connection with with fascism. Broadly speaking, I mean, could you explain the origins of Italian fascism, its legacy, and what is modern day Italy's relationship to its fascist past? Um, yes, could you please?
No, of course. I think when compared to compare, for instance, to Germany, Italy hasn't. I would argue hasn't dealt as effectively as Germany with with its its past, fascist past, in the sense that Germans have been very thorough in the way in which they dealt with their Nazi past, in the way in which they dealt with that unfortunate experience. Italy, in a sense, has never um, gone that far. To some extent, Italy could possibly be compared more to Japan than to Germany in terms of the extent to which the two countries have gone to, in a sense, deal once and for all with the past. There's been, of course, through the post-war years and era, there's been, of course, Movimento Sociale was a neo-fascist party, was a party that, in a sense, embraced some of the ideals of the fascist movement, of course, started by Mussolini after pretty much after the end of the First World War, and so there's always been a small core of sympathizers or nostalgics, if you like, of that experience, but they're not a huge number, I would argue. The Movimento Sociale Italiano essentially was, or the Italian social movement, if you were to translate it in English, was essentially disbanded in the 90s, or the party rebranded itself in National Alliance, or Alleanza Nazionale, under Gianfranco Fini. But under Gianfranco Fini and under Alleanza Nazionale, that party essentially rejected its fascist past, in the sense that Fini declared very clear that, well, that experience is over. Alleanza Nazionale is no longer neither fascist nor a neo-fascist party, fully embrace democracy. And essentially, that's the position of Brothers of Italy, which is, if you like, the newest version of Alleanza Nazionale. And so I would argue that actually Brothers of Italy, clearly if you like, the genealogy, of course, lies in Movimento Sociale Italiano, but in reality, Meloni several times has said that fascism is a long gone phenomenon, and of course, she has no desire, no interest in reviving it. But nonetheless, there are still small groups which are not affiliated with Brothers of Italy, who still believe in those ideas. For instance, Forza Nuova, which is a political group, a tiny political group, which still actually embrace that ideology. But to say that there's a political threat, or a threat of just the reemergence of fascism in Italy, I don't really see it. I don't really see it, and I see really no inkling of that. Even because, of course, even when of course Alleanza Nazionale was in government with Berlusconi, if you remember, in the first decade of the new century, there was no inkling that Alleanza Nazionale wanted to just push forward measures against political freedom, for instance, or any particular introducing legislation that would be anti-democratic. There was no inkling of that. So I think it's, in my view, if I were to be totally upfront with you, it's the left who keeps harping on this post-fascist legacy, only to conveniently forgetting that actually they haven't done perhaps that if you like the process of transformation or of change or rejecting the past Marxist Leninist ideology hasn't been fully complete. I mean, there was a meeting of a regional section of the Democratic Party 2 months ago near Bologna, and they were singing still the Third International, clinch fists, red flag with the armor and sickle. So does the PD, the Democratic Party, represents a danger to Italian democracy? Not at all. Are they really hardcore communists? Not at all. There are few old Marxist Leninist sympathizers within the party, probably so. But the echoes of the past inevitably are there, but risk for the Italian democracy on both sides of politics? No, I don't think so.
One other aspect of modern Italian politics is I've noticed is the rise of Euroscepticism. This is particularly surprising considering Italy could be argued to be one of the most truest of believers about the idea of a unified Europe. I mean, staunch support of the idea can be traced back to Mazzini, who envisioned a unified Europe under the leadership of a Third Rome, which was later supported by Mussolini's Terza Roma, and later, the EU founding document being the Treaty of Rome. Kratzy was pro-Europe as well, and it was very much going on even through Berlusconi. But I've noticed since the 2008 financial crisis, there's been one wave after the next of problems, such as the immigration influx, the EU overreach with deposing and appointing national leaders like Monti, and also the way they handled the lockdowns and COVID recently. I think we've seen a big increase of Italians questioning the reality of European integration and see is it worth it, considering after one problem after the next, it seems to be Italy always taking the brunt of whatever problem arises. Could could we see an eventual turnaround, or do you think your skepticism will be rising still in the future? I mean, ultimately, could we have a Italian exit as we saw with Britain?
That's a very interesting question. Thanks, Daniel. Just you're very right to point out that, of course, Italy within the last 20 years has transformed itself from one of the staunchest, as you pointed out correctly, believers in the European project, so to speak, or European integration, call it as you may, into a largely Eurosceptic country. And you're also very right to point out the impact of the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, which here in Australia you tend to call the GFC. Australians have a love sometimes for acronyms, but of course that had a significant impact on the emergence, or if you like, not necessarily the emergence, but on the rise and the strengthening of different populist parties on the left and right side of politics. That's not surprise because populism, in a sense, thrives in periods and moments of significant economic and financial instability. Look, for instance, no further than the 20s and 30s. So I think when there's a major economic crisis, it's not surprising to, and there's of course significant economic hardship as a result, it's not surprising to see the emergence of parties that are unhappy with the current status quo. They're vocally anti-establishment. And that's what has happened in Italy and to Italy, but this phenomenon is not simply confined to Italy only. Of course, this problem was also compounded by the fact that to some extent, Italy's entry into the European Monetary Union, or to be more, to make it more simple, Italy embracing of the euro currency to some extent, while it had a number of advantages, it also imposed a significant straitjacket on Italy. And one way for Italy to prosper out of the new currency was to adopt a number of significant economic reforms, particularly liberalization of markets and so on and so forth, which Italy did. But to some extent, it's been a complex process. These reforms haven't oftentimes fully implemented. And so Italy has not been able to grow as much as before, when the government could devalue the lira and therefore, if you like, regain competitivity by devaluing the lira. Once you adopt the euro, in a sense, there was, to make myself clear, before, Italy to some extent has always been perhaps less competitive compared to Germany, because the cost of producing goods per unit are higher than in Germany due to higher inflation and so on and so forth. One way by which in the past Italian governments used to, if you like, close this gap and regain a degree of the ability to compete was by devaluing the lira, and therefore with a weaker currency, in a sense, you would be offsetting higher inflation. Now, with the euro, in a sense, that was no longer possible. So the only way was to reduce costs by improving productivity, or at least to improve it to a level to be on par with Germany. That's has not always been the case. That, of course, is if you can't rise productivity, the problem is that then you have to cut, to cut jobs. If you can't contain costs, or if you can't really reduce costs, then through just greater profits and so on and so forth in terms of firms and so on and so forth, then what happens was that you have to cut jobs. So in a sense, the euro has been, in my view, has presented a significant challenge to Italian policymakers, but also to the wider system, and also firms, workers, and so on and so forth. So you had, if you like, the combination of two problems. One, which was the fact that the euro was an opportunity, but also a challenge. At the end, has been seen as a challenge more than an opportunity. And that's partly has been also Italy's fault, I would argue. And then on top of that, from 27, 28 onwards, you had the long effects of the global financial crisis, which has had also an impact on euro itself, because as it would be too long to explain why. But in a sense, that crisis also brought to the attention of international investors that the euro is a single currency, but that institutions behind the euro are still, and also, if you like, the financial and framework is not completely, is not streamlined. So, for instance, to give you an example, Daniel, of course, Europe is not still a federal state. So while certain competencies lie with European institutions, others are still within the prerogative of nation states. So you have a common currency, but still, of course, national governments, they have their own fiscal policies. Of course, their abilities to run full independent fiscal policies has been significantly diminished. Their monetary policies are increasingly constrained, but nonetheless, it's difficult to harmonize a number of countries, and therefore the bottom line was that, in a sense, what happens if one country, in this case Italy, for instance, if investors, given Italy, the fact that Italy has a high government debt, what if investors start losing faith in the system? Until before the financial crisis, the assumption was that no matter what, the European Union would be able to, there was no questions asked. Of course, with the euro, Germany will stand behind the euro. There won't be any run on a particular country or debt and so on and so forth. And then the financial crisis, and then the issues with Greece, and then investors fearing that actually Italy would not be able to repay the debt. And the fact that the Germans and others said, well, we are willing to help, but not to the point of covering Italian debts. And so to some extent has shown cracks in the armory, cracks in the euro framework. And so that, if you like, has also pushed the country to try to reduce its debt and so on and so forth. And of course, when you engage in significant spending cuts, then of course, in a sense, and people are asked to tie their belts more energetically, if you like, then of course the picture that you get, to cut a long story short, and I'm sorry for having been so long-winded on this particular question, then you have a fertile ground for the emergence of establishment party. Now, to come to the last part of your questions, it's Italexit a possibility, meaning the Italian version of Brexit. Journalists have called it Italexit. Is it possible? Look, to be totally frank with you, the two parties that over the past few years really peddled the idea of Italexit, which was the Northern League, or League as nowadays it calls itself, and Brothers of Italy, for instance, and even to some extent the Five-Star Movement on the left side of politics. Well, all these voices have quietened down, even because during COVID, Italy has received significant loans and from the European Union. And so COVID has shown actually that the European Union willy-nilly, or like it or not, actually provides a safety net for a number of countries in time of need. And so, to be honest, I don't think there's any desire within any political party at the moment to actually pull Italy out of the European Union, which would be ruinous from my point of view in economic terms. But also there's no desire, and I don't think there's even, at the moment, it's not even discussed. I mean, Meloni was fairly Eurosceptic, and now actually she has very much toned down the rhetoric, and in fact she's trying to work out a very, if you like, collaborative relationship with European institutions. So in the short, medium term, and even long term, no, I don't think that's a possibility. A different thing is if there's, let's say, international investors stop buying Italian bonds, then there's a risk of default. And then if there's a default, then the risk of an exit from the euro, or if is a possibility. But at that point would be something imposed on Italy rather than Italy deciding to, if you like, pull the plug and get out. I don't know if I've been clear enough. I hope I
No,
I
yeah,
was.
very much so. But unfortunately, I think what you said is the same old story of the leaders of political parties, they or Italy itself, with being bailed out one way or another, they essentially get, essentially get bought off. It's all hellfire and brimstone on the way to government, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. But then, when the money comes in, then it's, oh well, maybe it's not that bad. We'll reform. We'll talk, and then the fever kind of like dies down. With Yeah, I think it's bad to think. Do you think Europe, because Italy is basically one of the main pillars of the European Union, and as I said earlier, it's the Treaty of Rome was signed there, one of its constitution essentially. If Italy was ever to go, that would essentially be the end of the entire European project. I think we move. I think as bad as Brexit was, it was still survivable. But if Italy goes, that's it. Do you think the European establishment will do basically anything it can to keep Italy in there, regardless if they should or they shouldn't?
It's look. Of course, they would try to to um, to do that, but of course, it depends. If there's a default, then it's probably Italy probably would be have to abandon the euro currency. And of course, there's the risk that to some extent the country would lessening its ties with European Union. You're right. I mean, in the sense that European Union might not be what it was, but it's also possible to imagine that a group of core countries would still hang in together. For instance, I find it very hard to see France and Germany splitting from each other, or even France, Holland, Belgium, Germany. Those countries have invested so much on the European project. Of course, without Italy would be a much diminished European Union, and perhaps there could be, realistically speaking, a certain element of disgregation. But it's feasible to imagine. It's possible to imagine actually a core of countries sticking together, and in a sense, because really a full implosion of the European Union, I don't see it happening, because there's so many links binding several countries, and particularly the Western European core. There's so much political capital, economic capital, and not strictly in the economic sense, has been invested in creating these projects. And even if they wanted, it would be too difficult to completely untangle themselves from it. So it's various permutations, various scenarios are possible, but still it's very possible, in fact, indeed, very likely to imagine that a core of European nations would still underpin the European Union, in my view. Whether the European Union will be symbolically and politically less influential, that's quite possible, as you foreshadowing. But I don't think that an Italian exit would really spell the end of the European Union in general. Perhaps as we know it would be a diminished, if you like, a smaller or less influential European Union. But I don't see the union completely imploding and disappearing from Earth, really, if I could put it that way.
Well, that kind of touch upon my next question in talking about Europe and the spread of the anti-establishment, predominantly Eurosceptic parties right throughout the continent. I mean, we had the rise of Le Pen in France. We had the 2015 Greek referendum, which rejected the EU bailout, and the rise of the once Eurosceptic party Syriza. We had the AfD in Germany rise up. We have so much discontent going on, even now. Um, Even in very pro European EU countries such as the Netherlands, we've seen a rising skepticism within its minor parties as well, making some headway in the recent elections, such as the Forum of Democracy and JAR 21. Um, do you see it further increasing across Europe, or you touched upon it already, but more on a European level, not just Italian? Do you think this is going to continue? And is it possible for the EU to collapse within the next 10 to 20 years?
That's a very interesting question, and it's difficult for me to really see far ahead. I mean, if I were to, I mean, the risk of projecting. I always teach my students how to think. Sometimes look into the crystal ball and try to imagine the future, and to try to understand where the international system or even a region could possibly go in 10 or 20 years down the line, and the way in which sometimes we reach conclusions, which is to say, well, it's not far-fetched to assume, or it's possible to assume, or perhaps we run the risk that so and so would possibly happen. Of course, all these hypotheses are based on current trends, on current situations. But of course, current trends and the current status quo, while it might be an indication of things to come, it's not certainty. On the other hand, these things would eventually materialize. And so if we were to assume that in the major countries you have populist governments in power. Would that spell the end of the European Union? I mean, my guess is to say to you, no, it won't do that. Because in fact, in my view, and Italian experience is showing it now, but even before, during the previous green yellow government majority comprising the League, whose color is the green, and the Five-Star Movement, whose color was the yellow. Even under that sort of populist, how to put it, hybrid, because of course there were two parties of populist, you could call them populists, but then, if you like, putting forward different proposals and different programs. But even they came to power saying, well, the European Union and so on and so forth, and lambasting the European Union, criticizing it. But in reality, when the punch came to shove, they actually follow pretty much a straight line of fiscal, if you like, rectitude, if I could put it that way, which pleased Brussels. And Meloni is doing very much the same. So are these politicians, if you like, I think what has happened is that once you come to power, you realize actually what it is to govern. And also you realize the strong bonds that economic, nowadays social, political, cultural, that links Europe. I mean, if you look, for instance, at the current Polish government, you could call it fairly Eurosceptic. Doesn't particularly regard Brussels as, but nonetheless, the Poles, as they always been doing over the past 20 years, they're very much willing to take and not very willing to give. But well, and they are quite critical of Brussels, but would they leave the European Union? I don't think so. Would a France with Le Pen as a president would want to leave Europe, the European Union? I don't think so. What could realistically happen is that perhaps there could be tension within the system. There would be, if you like, a rebalancing within the European Union, which is, to some extent, nation states would try to claw back powers from the Brussels bureaucracy, and to some extent there would be a more intergovernmental system of government, which is, well, the major decisions are taken by the Council of Ministers and not necessarily by the Commission. But even then, that's what the situation is in at the moment within the European institutional framework. The balance has always been very much in favor of the Council of Ministers, so of nation states deciding what to do. The Commission can only propose and then implement. And so even if to some extent nation states would become more vocal and more critical of the European Commission, I still think the European Union would exist. But it's possible they would exist in a different configuration, with a core of still closely knit nation states, and then a more of Europe a la carte, if you like, with a core of still very integrated nations, and then perhaps a group of more loosely linked nation, and that's possible. But I don't think that the whole political construct would disappear in 20 years' time, even under significant political stress.
So you're basically saying if multiple countries manage to gain a Eurosceptic populist government at the same time, you can see the European Union reforming itself into a loose a loose, decentralized union of nation states as opposed to what it is now, which is more the centralization and federalization away from the national sovereignty to this overarching entity. Do you think
There could be a pullback in terms of certain policies. There could be no appetite for further integration. There could be, to some extent, again, a major influence of nation states within the Council of Ministers saying, well, we don't want to do this, or we don't want to do that, we don't want to. So it could take different forms and shape, but in reality, it's already even nowadays, to some extent, if you think the picture is quite complex, there's growing integration, in fact, and then there's stalling in certain areas, because of course, really ensuring that 27 countries move on the same pace, it's quite difficult. But look, on the other hand, COVID has actually acted as if you like, as actually emphasized the need of more integration in certain areas, and that has taken place. But also, if you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the response by the European Union, I think overall the response has been actually quite robust. And despite the fact that you had 27 countries, but nonetheless, several rounds of sanctions have been taken against Russia, and significant sanctions, sending arms and weapons to Ukraine through Poland. Of course, you could argue that more could be done, and but nonetheless, in only the past 12 months, European governments have taken, within the European Union, have taken decisions that they would have never taken before. They've taken them fairly quickly, with just very minimal disagreement, and that was no mean feat. So in a sense, even you would argue, just even the current Italian government, you could certainly describe it as populist in a sense, but in reality, on a number of issues, has been firmly in favor of, for instance, of Ukraine, as worked closely with the European institutions. So I think when significant problems arises, then those problems do focus policymakers' attention, and then there's little time for electionary, you put it, for politicking and playing party politics. And in reality, then you have to make tough decisions. And look, I of course, depending on where one position itself in political terms, but I've been a fairly, I thought the overall European project has been positive force for peace and stability in Europe. It hasn't been perfect, but overall it has, in my view, has been very positive. And again, it's when, even in the past 10 years, if you look at the past 10 years, there's been significant stress in the system. There's been significant squabbling, but then on key issues, actually, there's been way more unity than disunity, and even parties that came into power by if you like, waving the anti-Brussels flag, if I could put it that way. Then when they came to power, actually, they toned down the rhetoric. One, because they realized that it's easier to say things once you're in opposition. It's more difficult to govern, and also because you govern within a European framework, so there are also limitations to what you can do. But more to the point is the realization has always been the case that actually European problems are best resolved by if you like, solidarity more than fracturing and squabbling. So I'm relatively positive that even under pressure I mean, if France would have a populist president, then I'm sure that France rhetoric could become possibly, or Le Pen rhetoric could be, of course, strident, but to what extent that would push the system to implode, I'm not so sure. Actually, I would still remain moderately positive that no such a thing would actually happen.
Okay. Okay. Moving away from Europe and Italy, um, in regards to moving on to more Russia, um, it appears that the legacy of the Cold War is still being felt today, with many people, um, even within influential positions, still seem to view modern day Russia as almost still being like the Soviet Union. They seem to still have the Cold War mentality on their mind. Uh, Given your background in Cold War history, what can you tell us about the original Cold War compared to the modern day relationship of US and Russia?
That's in many ways it's a tough question. I think to some extent we have re-entered a Cold War climate, like it or not. It's
Maybe hot war.
the risk is always there. There's always a risk of escalation, and then accidental mistakes leading to further escalation. But look, it's the problem, I guess. Russia, I don't think it's, I mean, from where I stand as a European, momentarily transplanted in Australia, living in Australia, the problem with Russia is, of course, the end of the Cold War was a boon, not simply because the Soviet Union was no longer there and therefore no longer posed an ideological threat to the rest of Europe, and also, of course, everyone perhaps somewhat cynically hoped that Russia would be a much diminished power. And of course, Russia is always, in a sense, has been, how to describe it, the elephant in the China shop, because it's such a big country which spans from Europe to Asia. It's really a Eurasian country. And then, of course, it borders on, it's also part of Europe. And so, and when you look at Europe from a geopolitical point of view, you have this huge power on the border, well, just bordering with Eastern Europe, and therefore there's always going to be a certain degree of suspicion in what Russia may or may not do. And so I think the end of the Cold War was a boon, because the hope was that Russia would engage more closely with the West. By engaging more closely with the rest of Europe, in a sense, Russia would be a stakeholder in European stability rather than a spoiler. That, of course, was that's where Russia was heading to, really up until the 2004, 2005, Then, of course, there was a significant change in Russian foreign policy, which is from engaging with Europe actually to withdrawing from this engagement and then openly confronting the West on a number of issues. And so I don't think, to be honest, that we fear resurgence of the Soviet Union. I mean, I wouldn't say that Putin, as well his regime, or does not espouse any ideology, or doesn't really rely, sometimes its political discourse sometimes is quite ideological. But of course, Russia of today doesn't really represent by any stretch of imagination the same ideological threat that the Soviet Union presented during the Cold War. So I don't think no one sees Russia as, if you like, a Soviet Union undercover or a Soviet Union in the making, call it as you like. But nonetheless, the shock has been tremendous over the past 12 months, because you've seen the return to a fully fledged war in Europe, and the kind of rhetoric coming out of Moscow is scaring the hell out of many leaderships, and so of course the question remains to what extent whether Russia has had any reason to do what it did. In my view, of course, did not have any reason. You don't invade another country. And more to the point, the idea that NATO was a threat to Russia, to me, I have Russian friends, I talk to them, but I tell them, as I would tell you, it's simply laughable, in the sense that for anyone familiar with the rest of Europe, traveling, working, having spent months or years in Europe, you realize what little appetite exists in Europe for war and for a return to the past. I mean, if you look at key European countries over the past 30 years, they haven't really strengthened their military capabilities. In fact, they've cut back and failed to modernize in certain areas, to the point that nowadays, at the moment, one of the problems that the Europeans are facing and NATO is facing is that we might not be able to provide Ukraine with munitions and weapon system for too long if the war persists for 1 or 2 years. We're also running low on certain stocks of munitions and weapon system. And so to tell you that over the years, NATO countries have not invested in their military capabilities. And for Russia to say that actually NATO really presented a challenge, it's also, I think, laughable, because it's not that, I mean, you could argue that NATO has expanded to East, and in a sense it has expanded, but what expanding means in reality? If it means that a number of former Soviet satellites, as well as former Soviet republics, decided to seek membership of NATO to ensure themselves against the resurgence of Russia, is that really NATO posing a threat to Russia? I think it's very much a self-defensive measure by some. But of course, I also understand that Russia sees it as an infringement on its near abroad, or what they call limitrofa, the borderlands, or what was part of the former Soviet or Tsarist empire. And is that a reasonable view to have? I think if you were a sort of 19th century, early 20th century policymaker, the idea of sphere of influence is perfectly acceptable. And I don't have any problem in accepting that perhaps you should take into account certain Russian sensibilities, but on the other hand, to say that, as the Russians saying, are arguing that, well, it's NATO waging a war against them, they reacted because to some extent NATO was trying to push Ukraine into its midst. Well, I think it's just it's rather would have been Ukraine under the new leadership wanting to join the European Union and NATO, and if they'd done so, of course, probably they would not have been invaded by Russia. But to cut a long story short, I think the current leadership in Moscow, it's doing its best to send the wrong message, and in a sense instilling the fears that actually the current Russia could be an unfriendly power, as the Soviet Union was just during the Cold War.
Interesting. I would, push back a little bit on that one. With I can understand. I mean, with Russia, I can understand the historical fear of being invaded, and they're still being haunted by World War II. So they've learned that lesson. So they're very particular about any encroaching forces near their borders. They learned that very much the hard way. I think they also saw the way the US has been, I suppose, treating other countries like Iraq, Iran, Libya, and this anti-Russian rhetoric within America, going back. I think it really ramped up around 2008, 2007. It started to get more focused on Russia. Also, more recently, it came out the idea of Merkel. I think she admitted that she signed with the Minsk agreement. I can't remember now, but basically she admitted going, yeah, we signed the documents, but we were just, buying time. We didn't really mean it. I mean, there's that, and also the idea of even recently the Nord Stream pipeline. Apparently, it's now been, there's much more, I suppose, evidence coming out that it's more of the US blowing it up. So when you're confronted with all these other aspects going on, also geopolitically, I think the unipolar moment of the US dominance is now coming to an end, and we're seeing more of a multipolar world coming up again, not just with Russia, but also, India, China, Brazil, and everything else. I think the US is more acting like the typical behavior of a power trying to cling on to its dominance. I think Russia, when it comes to its landmass and its resources and everything else, is a second America in that way. So they're one of the few countries that can offer some pushback, unlike the smaller countries that I mentioned, before. What do you say about that side of the issue? I mean, it's not as if, I'm not some Putin apologist, but it's not as if he got up one morning and went, well, I'm gonna invade a country because I want to. There's all these other aspects going on, and I don't think a lot of people realize the other nuances of what's happening. I mean, also with Ukraine, I mean, the whole issue of Ukraine didn't start in 2020. It started all the way back in 2014 with the the essentially the coup back in the day, back then as well. So I think there's a lot more going on than what's being reported. Do you see any other, I suppose, any anything from the Russian point of view, the stuff that I just named?
You raised a number of very interesting issues, which in a sense would take time to unpack, from U.S. foreign policy to the emergence of a
Sorry.
new multipolar system, and Russia itself. So it reminds me of um, just it's a question with many questions, and all of them all very good questions, and all of them deserving at least a few minutes. Many questions in one question, but perhaps coming to the last one, whether I see any reason in
The Russian point of
in
view.
what Russia does, or any point of view. I try to understand the Russian point of view because I'm very interested in policy making. So I think if you want to, if you're interested in policy making, and if you're interested in strategizing or thinking about, you need to understand the other side. You need to understand where they come from, and you need to understand what the motivations are, and so, to cut a long story short, going back to the 27 and 28, for instance, when the United States made quite clear that they were in favor of Ukrainian membership of NATO and European Union in the long term. And of course, that scared Putin off. And to some extent, of course, he came to the conclusion that actually the Americans were out there to if you like, do him over, if I could put it colloquially, and so I do understand. In fact, I always argue that NATO should tread very carefully, and the United States should tread very carefully in terms of mentioning the possibility in the long term, even in the very long term, of Ukrainian membership of NATO, for the simple reason that perhaps we would end up where we are nowadays. And so, is Russia also doing something different from previous great powers? Of course not. But on the other hand, what is it that we really, if we really want to even try to understand the Russian point of view, what is it that we should do then? I mean, because for the past, you're right to point out that essentially the Ukrainian imbroglio didn't start last year, but it's a long-drawn story dating back to 2014 and possibly even before. So what is the alternative? Is that are we saying that a country like Ukraine, for instance, cannot choose its own future, its own political orientation, and its alliances, and should be always, if you like, bound by what Russia expects it to do? I mean, perhaps in realistic terms, it's inevitable that the Ukrainian leadership should perhaps be aware that only a neutral status could possibly apply to it. But at the end of the day, even if we look at the expansion of NATO into eastward, what does that expansion mean at the end of the day? It means a number of, as I said before, a number of formerly independent states wanting to, if you like, get an insurance against Russia. Could we blame them? Could I blame them for doing so? Actually, with the benefit of hindsight and with my lesson of my sense of Russian history, I said, well, if I was a Polish leader, would I want or not want to join NATO? I would rush into join NATO. If that, of course, that doesn't play well in Moscow, but Russia is 100% wrong, in my view, has invaded a country. Its rhetoric is just belligerent. And I tend to see here in the West, in Australia, a certain, always a very strong criticism of the United States, which in sometimes is fully understandable, but sometimes is just, I mean, I haven't seen anyone, very few protesting against Russian invading Ukraine in this country. And yet, if the United States had done only one fraction of what Russia did, there would be the streets of George Street would be full of people chanting. And what I'm trying to say is that there's a sort of, that doesn't excuse, of course, United States have been, in my view, as a great power, have taken a number of very, if you like to say the least, for instance, the 2003 invasion of Iraq or intervention of Iraq, of course, that did not take place under the aegis of the United Nations, and therefore, in my view, was extremely questionable. But even then, I think, even when the United States took, in my view, a wrong decision, even because Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction, but perhaps we should ask ourselves whether perhaps Saddam Hussein was too clever by half, pretending not giving full access to the UN inspectors, and therefore keeping up the pretense that perhaps he was hiding weapons of mass destruction. If he had gone completely clean, I don't think there would have been an American military action against his regime. But to cut a long story short, whether are the United States unblemished? I don't think so. But on the other hand, whether I regard the United States as a force of stability with all their just defects or wrong decisions, I still regard them as a force for stability, because they are a democracy. There's a vibrant, I would call it a vibrant democracy. Some people argue that American democracy is in crisis. Well, it's under stress, but to me, it has the ability to withstand political squabbles. And in my view, let me put it to you in a different way, and of course, and to your listeners in a different way. And of course, it's perfectly fine if your listeners and yourself are completely and fundamentally in disagreement with me. But would an international system essentially under the influence or of China or Russia, would the international system be better than the current international system under a benign, what I would regard overall a benign hegemon? My answer is that Australia, for instance, has enjoyed a significant degree of peace and stability. And Australia close links with the United States and being part of a Western alliance has not been stranger to that. Would Australia be accorded and afforded the same level of stability and peace under an Asia-Pacific dominated by China? I frankly don't think so. And not because I I'm inherently suspicious of China and the Chinese people. I'm suspicious of the Chinese Communist Party. And so is a multipolar system inherently more stable than the current one? I don't think so. Is the current international system bound to remain unipolar? I don't think so. But nonetheless, I think while we need to understand the Russians, I mean, I don't know if you've watched the news, but 3 days ago, in Lavrov spoke in Delhi when in front of an Indian audience, he clearly argued with a straight face that actually Russia was attacked. And I think people actually, the people present laughed it off because it was simply. So what I'm saying, we need to understand Russia, but there's a point. I mean, in the last 12 months, all we got from Russia was threats on nuclear escalation, truculent propaganda and interference. And are the United States completely, if you like, I would say that they've certainly have supported Ukraine. Of course, they've been involved in strengthening the Ukrainian army. And of course, the Russians saw that. And perhaps we could argue that what Putin did was a preemptive measure to ensure that, well, if he really wanted to ensure that Ukraine would never move closer to the West, he would have to move sooner rather than later, because actually the Ukrainian forces were being strengthened by the British and the Americans. And so I see the point, but I do condone it. No, what the Russians are complaining about when, for instance, in Vietnam and Korea, they were providing aid to the North Koreans or the North Vietnamese, and there's a bit of element of tit for tat. The United States also, to your listeners, I would point out that actually only 3 or 4 years ago, President Macron was saying that basically NATO was brain dead. And over the past 10 years, we've been hearing different presidents, President Barack Obama and also Trump, arguing that the United States should, if you like, disengage from certain areas of the world or play a much lesser role. Perhaps Obama articulated it in much more diplomatic and less blunt and strident language than Trump. But nonetheless, the message was, I mean, he mentioned we should be leading from behind, which is basically a contradiction in terms. Either you leading from the front or you don't lead at all. But in fact, he came up with that metaphor in a sense to convey the idea that, well, the Americans were still willing to lead, but actually the allies should take the first steps, and essentially the United States would only support them from behind. But nonetheless, the message was very clear that he was looking to play a more modest or reduced role in international affairs. Trump, of course, his rhetoric was way more strident and undiplomatic and oftentimes rude. But he also argued that, in a sense, unless the Europeans pay up their dues within NATO, increase the defense spending, he would plan to disband it, or the United States will lose interest. And therefore, actually, what Putin has done is, despite what the previous presidency was all raving about, which was the Europeans should be spending more, otherwise we pull out, and to the point that President Macron argued that actually NATO was brain dead. Putin actually, by doing this, has actually strengthened NATO to the point that the very peaceful Swedes and the Finns are willing to join NATO. So I do see the Russian point of view, because of course Putin is a very realpolitik, great power, and of course is just in a competition with the United States. And of course, here's realizing that, if you like, in the pool of democracy within, with you call it European Union or NATO as a security guarantee, in many ways is unresistible, because long memories do exist. Eastern Europeans don't trust Russia, and nowadays, frankly, how could you blame them? But of course, I wouldn't say that. While trying to understand the Russian point of view, I think they've gone the wrong way. And I thought actually that they would simply invade the Donbass, but instead they went for broke. They tried to advance towards Kiev and to try to decapitate the regime. And until now, they haven't been successful. So I think it's going to be a long war, and we'll see how. But to cut a long story short, I just and I would also, I mean, that probably could be even more controversial, in a sense that the Russians go into break, the Americans go into break, but then they rebuild to some extent. I wonder what Russia will do in Donbass. Perhaps they will. But look, they've given, even at the most, when I was most critical of the American intervention in Iraq, compared to what I see done in Ukraine, is just the two experiences of war fighting are even quite different in my way. I'm not condoning the invasion of Iraq, but in terms of the way in which was conducted, and of course there's significant criticism to, for instance, to the way the Americans, to some extent, even bungled that war, but nothing compares to actually the brutality of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, which is true to their form, I would say. But perhaps here, just I wouldn't want to come across as an anti-Russian, which I'm not. But my experience of an historian actually, I just teaches me that for the past 100 years. Of course, I had no sympathy for the Soviet Union, but to some extent, the way in which Putin goes about asserting Russian power is profoundly disquieting, and I would leave it at that.
Okay.
I'm giving your listeners food for thought, and I don't
Yes.
pretend to necessarily to please them, or don't
Oh
pretend
no,
them to
no.
be in agreement. It's just my view based on my reading of history and what I see. But of course, I understand that other people might come to it from different directions. And I think what I always tell my students, and that's how I run my classes, is just to encourage debate and even disagreement. I enjoy actually just people disagreeing with me all the time.
Well, that's actually fantastic to hear because especially nowadays, even as reports in academia, there seems to be a bit of groupthink going on, and critical thinking and argument seems to be eroded these days. So it's good to see that, and that's why I invited you on. I wanted you to give me your opinion and give me what you think. And if I disagree with it, that's okay. That makes the conversation interesting. So yeah, no need to apologize. That's what I wanted.
No, it's you're right, because I just you actually put the finger on the spot, which is, I mean, we can come clean towards your listeners, because of course I met you at university, where one of my students, and in a sense you also you just made it, you made this very interesting and very true statement from my point of view, that in today's universities there's an element of groupthink, and my sense is that students, depending on the course they take, but students are more or less encouraged to actually debate issues freely. In my course is one of my I pride myself with trying to avoid groupthink and try to put students, as you did with me. Look, Andrea, there's any validity in what Russia does, and actually, with my students, I hide my, and I let them discuss. Okay, just then how do we deal with it? Even if, and so I think that's the right way of seeing things, to try to always understand the other, because unless we try really to understand them, then we run the serious risk of misunderstanding them. And in policy terms, it's a big risk. But also we also need at the same time to be very clear in what our responsibility are, and try, if we are responsible for, try to address that issue, but also to say, well, no, you push back, or we just no, we don't accept this, your line, and if we don't like it, then we'll take measures. But just in my view, all the cards needs to be on the table, which is these issues needs to be discussed, because otherwise, what measures do you take? What policies do you pursue? How do you judge your enemy or rival? How do you deal with him or with? And you need to if there's not an open debate, even amongst policymakers, but even within societies, we're just doing a terrible disservice to ourselves. So I'm glad that you asked me those questions, and I enjoyed really much discussing these issues with you openly, and in a sort of no old, how do you say, bar type of approach, which is just questions are tough and answers might be controversial.
Okay, I didn't know my question was tough though. Yeah, but I hope they were, fair.
They,
um,
they are they're fair, but they also were quite. I mean, I enjoy all of them. They were quite complex and quite dense, and I hope I've done a good service to your program, and that your listeners will find it interesting.
okay, well, you've been very generous with your time, and I think we'll conclude our interview now. And I want to say thank you for coming on to the show, and I hope to do this again with you again sometime in the future.
Absolutely, Daniel. Just thanks for inviting me, and we'll keep in touch, and say goodbye to your listeners as well. So to the next time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye, Daniel. Bye.